So good afternoon, everybody. Mary Hunt here at the Water Office. I want to welcome each and every one of you. This is Wednesday, May the 12th in the US at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the East Coast. And it is Thursday, May 12th in Australia, where my friend Kathleen McPhillips is, and it's 6 o'clock in the morning for her. So let us give her great kudos for joining us at all, much less at this hour. And so, Kath, we're delighted to have you. Here's our topic.
Thank you, Mary.
The End of Religion, Feminist Reappraisals of the State, which is a book edited by Kath and Naomi Goldenberg. And I am here at the Water Office with Diane New in the blue screen background, and Annalie Martin, who is our staff colleague. Diane is the other co-director here at Water, and Annalie is our staff colleague from the Mennonite Voluntary Service Program. And we are delighted to have you with us. Our topic today is a challenging one. Kath McPhillips and Naomi Goldenberg's important volume, The End of Religion, Feminist Reappraisals of the State, published by Routledge in November of 2020. And this is one of those books that has come out, as it were, during the pandemic time. And I'm very interested in promoting books that have come out at a time when they might not have gotten the promotion that they deserve. And this is one of those books that I think is going to endure, as well as need to be discussed at this point. Now, Naomi Goldenberg has proposed the term and the theory of vestigial state for understanding, think of the appendix, one of those vestigial organs, for understanding how the category of religion operates in, I'm quoting her now, in the regulatory jurisdiction of states. In other words, religion is not something separate from the state, but something she understands to be very much a part of it. Her feminist frame for this is the idea that if the feminist axiom, the personal is political, which we've all heard, is going to continue to be useful, it must include religion, she says, quote, in order to effectively address erosion of protection and support for women, persistent backsliding on reproductive rights, and restrictions on gender expression. This is from page 3 of the introduction for those of you who may have the volume. In other words, what Naomi's saying is we need to interrogate religion as a category rather than simply accept it as given and rearrange the deck chairs of religion, as it were. The editors, Kathleen and Naomi, have taken this central idea and made it their own with 11 essays in a book that extends this central tenet from Naomi, which is that religions are continuous with government, and religion is continuous with government and not distinct from it. The authors look at this dynamic in Australian, Canadian, British, Mexican, and US contexts, laying out a new body of work that will, I hope and I believe, change the way we think about religion in feminist circles. That's what's so important here. This is a book that's changing ideas. It will amplify our efforts in the major, may I call them religious traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and others, to see more clearly the pernicious ways that the assumptions of religion being something apart from the state have been useful in colonizing and marginalizing people. That's what we're going to talk about today. And Kath and Naomi, I couldn't be happier to have you both with us. Like all of Water's efforts, this Water Talk is not simply an academic seminar. It's serious conversation, but it's a way to learn in order to bring what we learn to the creation of a more just and equitable world. Water just doesn't do it for the fun of it. We do it for the creation of a more just and equitable world. By studying this new and challenging approach, we can bolster our efforts around the world in feminist work in, dare I say, religion, to deconstruct structures even more adequately and more efficiently and bring about more change. Let me turn now to introductions and a warm welcome again to our speakers. I hope you've had a chance to peruse the PDF we sent you, which includes a generous excerpt from an otherwise scandalously expensive book. Yes, so you can delve into these. It's scandalously expensive. It has nothing to do with you. I'm working on another one at the moment with some people who are in the same boat. And it's worthy of another seminar to talk about the economics and politics of publishing, because it's really scandalous. Working on a book with a woman in Cuba where the book costs 3 times the monthly salary of a Cuban person. Would you pay 3 months' salary to read anything? Mm-hmm. Don't start me. Let me introduce our speakers and then we'll have a chance to go on with this. They are wonderful friends and colleagues, so it's my pleasure. Dr. Naomi Goldenberg is professor of religious studies at the University of Ottawa in Ottawa, Canada. Naomi, we met in Berkeley, I think around 1976 when we were just coming out of sixth grade, if I remember correctly. Naomi has edited Religion as a Category of Governance and Sovereignty in 2015, and is the author of 3 books, Resurrecting the Body, Feminism, Religion, and Psychoanalysis, The End of God. See, she started this early.
Yeah.
And Changing of the Gods, Feminism and the End of Traditional Religion. Naomi served on the editorial board of the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion since its founding in 1985. And she has gotten me through a number of those board meetings with her brilliant sense of humor. She's active in the American Academy of Religion and the North American Association for Studies in Religion. I always consider our dinner at the AAR the highlight of the meeting. Naomi's graduate students are deeply appreciative of her teaching. I think it's fair to say that she's mentored several generations by now, including some of the leading lights in the field. Thanks for being here, Naomi. It's great to have you. And Dr. Kathleen McPhillips is a senior lecturer in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Newcastle in Australia. I think we first met Kath, if I remember correctly, in Boston at a conference some years ago. Though I knew your late mother's name very well through Catholic women's circles in Australia. She was a contemporary and a colleague of a water stalwart, the late Patricia Horsley. And what a generation they were, and how lucky we were to have them as our foremothers. Kath's main areas of research are gender and religion. She's a sociologist of religion and gender and employs feminist, psychoanalytic, and sociological frameworks to issues around gender and religion, particularly around institutional child sexual abuse in religious organizations. She has extensive experience in analyzing the Catholic Church, especially at the Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sexual Abuse. She's had a number of research grants, and her most recent publications are in Child Abuse and Neglect, Feminist Theology, the Journal of Australian Studies, Psychoanalytic Dialogues, and the Journal for the Academic Study of Religion. And today, Kath, I understand how you get so much work done and why you're so prolific. You're up this early in the morning. We are indebted to you and your colleagues, Kath, for leading the way on the clergy criminal sexual abuse front. I want to thank you personally for that. I'm sorry that COVID restrictions will prevent you and so many others from Oz from being at the AAR this year, but we'll save you a seat at the gourmet table next year and lift a good wine to your health. Now, as we move to Kath and Naomi, let me simply conclude by reading what we at Water said about this book. And again, The End of Religion. I actually hawk these books. This is one of my jobs here. The End of Religion, Feminist Reappraisals of the State, published by Routledge in November of 2020. We said this: all of the feminist deconstructions of religion are for naught if the fundamental meaning of religion is not interrogated. This volume offers new insights into the whole enterprise, inviting foundational changes to the field if scholars are courageous enough to be sufficiently critical. Welcome, my friends, Naomi and Kathleen. We look forward to hearing your presentation and engaging in a conversation about the end of religion. Thank you, and we're now in your extremely capable hands.
So I want to thank Mary. I want to thank everybody at Water, Diane, and I want to thank all of you for showing up. I'm really, really grateful. And because Mary did such a great job in introducing the book, I have nothing to say. So I'm going to start off with talking about what I had decided not to talk about. I decided it was too weird and I wasn't going to talk about it, but that's how I'll start off. A long time ago, when my daughter was very small, she was playing by the sea in Cape Cod. And it was a gorgeous day, and the beach was full of people as far as the eye can see in the water and on the sand. And I, who take a long time to get into the water, was going into the water very, very slowly, watching this beautiful scene, and I saw a big fin. I saw a fin going in and out of the swimmers, and I thought, isn't that cute? People are playing with a shark toy. And then it occurred to me, oh my God, that's a shark. I have just seen a shark, but how could I have seen a shark when nobody else in this whole beach has seen a shark? So what did I do? I said nothing. I moved back. I hit my husband when I saw it again. And then we both started yelling shark. and thousands of people came out of the water. Now, I've thought about that a lot. I thought about, why did I need my husband to witness this before I started screaming shark? But I've also thought about it in reference to this topic, because I think I've seen something here. And I've seen something that a whole lot of people, I'm sure, have seen before, but I'm putting it in a kind of way that I don't really see too many people have put before. And I think it's something to be built on, something that will be improved, something that will be changed. So one way to think about it is that by the end of religion, what Kath and I are talking about is the end of religion as a separate thing, as a thing that is thought of as distinct from other kinds of things, as unique, as mysterious, as always having been there, as existing in this form, as existing in that form. That is what we're meaning by the end. Another way to think of it is that what this is a developing feminist theory of religion as opposed to a feminist theory of theology. We have terrific feminist theology. We have terrific feminist theology. That is not what we're doing here. What we're doing is talking about how ideas, things, behaviors get organized into a particular category that has a particular relationship to government. And anything can go into that category, because anything can go in, anything can go out. Ideas about God can go in, ideas about God can go out, ideas about goddesses can go in, ideas about goddesses can go out. It's a very, very flexible category. The thing that we're concerned about is the way it's used by government, and the way it is also employed by the people who identify with that category within governments. Okay, so it's a theory of the category of religion, not a theory of theology. Okay, now I also know that it's deadly to talk on Zoom for very long, but I did want to talk about the two strands of theory that feed into this, that I think have let me see the shark. Okay, the first one is something that it's been going on with a group of guys for a long, long time in the field of religious studies, and that's called critical religion. Sometimes it's called critical religion, sometimes it isn't. It's a deconstruction of the category itself, of the category of religion. You can attribute the beginning to a lot of different people. I would say it's been going on for about 20 years, taking apart this idea that there's a phenomenon, a thing, sort of in an Eliadian way, called religion that we can recognize over time. And I would think that I've been very interested in this group. I've been very interested in their writings. I think that they've been enabled to do that because of feminism. Because if it hadn't been feminism taking apart the categories of male and female, these guys wouldn't have had the thought to take apart something like the category of religion. But they don't recognize that because basically they're guys. Okay, the other component is, of course, feminist theory that's always taken a political stance. And here I'm thinking of The Personal is Political, which builds on Simone de Beauvoir's insight that one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman, which also builds on, I think of Judith Butler as another thinker along that line, who takes apart what is called metaphysics and brings it down into political interest. Okay. And I'll just give one quick Canadian example of the importance of the personal as political. In 1970, there was a Royal Commission on the Status of Women in Canada. There was not one word mentioned about spousal violence, domestic assault. Why? Because that was still considered private. That was still considered, it was invisible. So when you had the personal as political sort of percolating in society for a while, you began to have things like domestic assault, wife abuse coming to the fore. And before that, that was invisible. Okay, so blah, blah, blah. I'm skipping a lot of this. One of the distinctions between religion as a vestigial state, the way I discuss it in the book, and religion and the state itself as a dominant category, if we had vestigial states and we had dominant states, is violence, the category of violence. It's very, very important. Max Weber stated over 100 years ago that violence, and by that he meant police or martial violence, is always controlled by the dominant state. The state sometimes franchises that out, but that is never, never what's attributed to the category of religion, except for a little bit of exception, which I'll go on about just a little bit. So we think of violence, if you have something that's categorized as a religion and it gets violent, right away we start questioning whether this is really a religion. So you start to see that violence is the sine qua non of what gets attributed to the category. Let me mention that the only exceptions here are violence against women and children. That is sometimes franchised out to religions, where you would have certain groups that are allowed to have special courts about spousal assault. And also we allow religions to modify or to attack the genitals of both male and female infants. That's a form of violence that we put out into under a category of religion sometimes. So I think that's rather important, and I wanted to think about that. Okay, I'm running out, just one more minute. I'm not a historian, but I've looked at, for those of you who maybe won't read the book, I'll just give you a couple of examples of what I mean by vestigial states. It works very well in reference to Judaism. Who are Jews anyway? We never know whether to put Jews as religions, as ethnicity, whatever. Jews were or are a group of people, different groups, whatever, that over time became defined as a religion because they were conquered by a succession of empires. So basically, now you have Judaism as a religion. And you can see what's happened vis-a-vis the state of Israel is that this vestigial state of religion can also become part of the software of government, can become a dominant state. And I'll just give a couple more examples and then I'll be done. Things get categorized as religions to domesticate them. You have in Canada, you have something called Indigenous Spirituality. And that's everything that is not attributed to Indigenous government. Spirituality is a way to tame it, is a way to move it to the side. You never had something called a religion of Hinduism until you had colonialism there, and then Hinduism, whatever gets done in the Indus Valley gets categorized as a religion. We can also apply it to pagans. There wasn't a thing called paganism as a religion. There were ways of life that got categorized as an ism afterwards, after this group was, and these people were displaced after their habits were moved aside. And then the last example I'll give is Islam. You'll have Muslims who say, Islam isn't a religion, it's a way of life. I agree. It becomes defined as a religion when it's not part of the dominant state. And in a sense, Islam is now existing in both ways. It's existing as a religion, it's existing as a dominant state. There's a lot of nuance here. There's a lot more to say, but I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Kath.
Thanks, Naomi. That's a good start on this. I want to make clear this is a complex topic, and it may take us more than one time to go through it to have an understanding. But Kath, it's great that you're picking it up because you do that exactly in the book, not only in the introduction, but also in your own excellent chapter. You make it very clear for us. So please go right ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Marion. Yeah, it is, as you can hear from Naomi, it is quite a challenging concept. And I remember when I first heard Naomi talking about this, like it took me quite a while to wrap my head around it and start to understand what it was that she was actually proposing here. And my feeling about it is it's a game changer. It actually can really transform the way that we are thinking about religion as a phenomenon, as a category. I know that one of the things that Naomi does when she's teaching this is that she asks people when they're talking about or discussing this, not to use the word religion. So every time you're trying to, explain something or describe something, don't use the word religion, use something else. And it was a really good technique for me to be able to understand what it was that was being described and analysed here. So I think I'll just, Naomi's given a great introduction now. I think I'll just step back a bit and just try and describe some of the examples that we used in the book. So that might be helpful for people to understand it. So what we're suggesting is that religion is an organising principle for governance in civil society. And not normally, especially in Western democratic societies, we would think of, the typical way to think about religion is this separation between church and state. And that's the sort of central descriptor of a secular society. And what's been suggested here is pretty much the opposite, that what religions have this particular function in Western societies. And we are arguing that, not just Western societies, because some of the chapters in the book talk about, for example, Larissa Garrett talks about what happens in Mexico. So this is the kind of idea that religion is playing a very important function, that we, it's very opaque, we don't see it. It's almost like we've had the wool pulled over our eyes, where religion is managing certain important aspects of civil society. And as Naomi said, we think that one of the things that's been managed here is violence against women and children, and that the state gives certain privileges to religions. For example, they are exempt from some of the anti-discrimination human rights laws. This is certainly the case in Australia. They may not pay taxes in the way that other institutions do, and they are just seen in a very different light. And one of the key terms here that separates religions from other kinds of institutions is the word tradition. And tradition just holds so much in it, because it's about sort of like, it's almost like an ahistorical kind of claim about, well, we can't change because we're a tradition and we've done this for thousands or hundreds of years, etc., etc. So that's one thing. And I think understanding how this works, and how structural issues of violence against women are actually seen as a natural category, and that's something that we have to accept because there is this kind of practices of tradition. So some of the examples that were really powerful were, for example, Sukhwant Dhaliwal talks about multi-faithism in Britain. And that is a new sort of ideology and governance technique that Blair introduced actually when he was in power. And it's actually about the state, the secular state, managing faith groups and bringing them into the sphere of governance in such a way that what is recognised there are religious groups that are actually patriarchal formations. So in multi-faithism, women are coming out very poorly, and this ideology is actually giving men control, and it's legitimating the control of men over women in new forms. So it's a very dangerous kind of ideology. Interestingly, what Naomi and I have a sort of critique of secularism, but in her chapter, Sukwant is just sort of suggesting that secularism is really important because it's a point at which you can critique multi-faithism. Andrew Pump has written a very interesting chapter on the history of Catholic social thought through the 19th and 20th century and the ways in which Catholicism developed so that it had what we might call a sort of moral agenda. And in this moral agenda, which ideologically was focused on poverty and the importance of the Catholic social agenda in relieving poverty and discrimination, but it was actually focused on moral sort of a morality of sexualities, in particular women and homosexuality. And if you read it carefully, you can see the vestigial state in there, that in managing this, the Catholic Church has become a form of, is acting as a form of vestigial state where it kind of is controlling these sort of sexual discourses. And it's a sort of rationale for regulating sexuality in women's bodies. And then in my chapter, I'm talking about the sort of management and regulation of Islam in Australia, particularly by governments. And one of the things that we can see over the last few years is that the government actually is positioning Islam as a state, so that when Islam makes certain claims that come too close to looking like a secular state, these restrictions will be applied to it, and they're not just sort of they're not just sort of state restrictions. They're also moral restrictions. And what's at stake here is that it's women's bodies, and that are the sort of boundary between the religion and the state. And that's where the whole debate gets sort of focused. So this whole discussion about veiling and the morality of veiling, the morality around women's sexual expression and piety, etc., is what we listen to. And you know, when things with Islamic State have been at a sort of breaking point in Australian society, you know, when we've seen young people go over to fight for Islamic State, or where there are fears about terrorism, the response is actually focused on what women are doing, what Muslim women are doing. And, you know, listening to their stories, lots of women going out the door and being abused in the street for wearing the veil, et cetera, et cetera. So that violence against women increases. And of course, not Barbara Greenberg, but Larissa Garrett's work on Mexico is really important here, because she's talking about the ways in which the state and the drug cartels utilize religion as this sort of patriarchal tradition to focus attention away from what is happening on the state. Really interesting, in 2012, when Pope Benedict visited Mexico, the drug cartels in the state just had a sort of amnesty, and they stopped fighting so that the Pope could progress in peace, which is a really interesting concept in terms of these are kind of forms of legal and illegal states recognizing that there is a greater state here, the Catholic Church. So yeah, those are just some examples in the book of the way that the authors are treating vestigial states and taking it into these case studies in order to understand how this is a category of violence against, of sexual violence, really, and that the question for us, I guess, or the thing that we wanted to, and I'll end with this, is that we did want to sort of challenge feminism to say that we think that feminism has accepted this category of religion fairly uncritically. And while it's very happy to kind of deconstruct religions as patriarchies and the state as patriarchy, it hasn't really come to terms or understood what it is, this thing called religion is. And because it's such a common sense category, it's just pretty much left alone and accepted. And we're saying we think that's really dangerous, and it's not helping women's liberation projects, and actually leaving violence against women in place, and that we really need to look at it much more closely. So that's what we're trying to do.
Thanks, Kath. That's very clarifying. I really appreciate both of your presentations, Naomi Goldenberg and Kath McPhillips, the editors of this volume, The End of Religion, Feminist Reappraisals of the State. No, Naomi, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to add, thinking about what Kath has been saying, this is so important, just really quickly. When you brought up the idea of how I try to say, don't use the category of religion, use something else, I'm to supplement that a little bit. I mean, trying to name things a little more specifically. So talk about Christianity, even though Christianity is a huge category, or talk about Judaism, even though that's a huge category and there are many Judaisms, so that we're not validating once again this huge category. And then the other thing that I want to emphasize is, yes, violence, but also male dominance. That because religion, things are recognized as religions if they validate male dominance, so that the state as a male form, as male hegemony, always seems more legitimate if there are men in charge. And it makes women's leadership seem more flimsy. So there'll always be a return to male leadership, because that seems, because of religion, because of the vestigial states within it that are preserving the idea that men are the ones who should be in charge, mystified male rule, that we get to see male dominance being reproduced. And I also wanted to bring up that word tradition that you highlighted. There's very good critiques about tradition via Tuna, critiquing the word tradition, which is another word we have to look at, but it's religion that gets put into constitutions, that gets put into law, and that's why we've got a particular focus on this. People are generally say, well, what about anything? Anything can be deconstructed. Yes, that's true, but this particular thing has a certain kind of status that's preserving patriarchy. Okay, so that's all I'll say.
Great. Well, wonderful presentations both, and your own enthusiasm for the topic obviously hasn't waned. I hope that at some point in the conversation, we will talk also about how this great error, as you call it, of segmenting off religion as something special and protected has not only had an impact on women and structural sexism, but also on people of color and structural racism, which I think would be another very important thing to talk about here. So especially the phenomenon of Black churches as among the most important businesses in Black communities and how they're part of the state as such. So that, I just want to say that I have been living with this book for a while, and I have a list of questions as long as my arm, but I'm going to open it up so that we stop. Mary Jelinek, you're first.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. My name is Mary Jelinek. I live in New York. I majored in political science, and hearing you reminded me of how we talked about politics. We were taught that politics is who gets what and who decides.
Right.
But you've opened up a whole new question for me today, and I think this is really interesting. There's another question: how are those decisions justified? We've never asked that question. I think what you're saying is that religion justifies who gets what and who decides. So it's part and parcel of classic political analysis, but it explains a lot. This is really wonderful. I'm going to read your book, so thank you.
could I say something?
Yeah,
Or-
please, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thanks for that a lot. What I'm working on now, I'm trying to get a monograph together. And you might, as a political scientist, remember Carol Pateman's book, The Sexual Contract? Maybe it was a classic in the 1980s, in which she talks about contract theory as not as ignoring an earlier contract, which she calls the sexual contract. So I'm tying some of this thinking now to that, to see how religion becomes a place where earlier contracts about the subjugation of women have been preserved. So I just wanted to bring that into, since it's part of political theory.
Yeah, I think that's just a great point, Mary, and you've said it really simply and really well. And I guess a good example of that is in Australia, the Catholic Church is the second largest employer in the nation. And it is responsible for over 90% of the government's social policy, of enacting social policy. So it's a very large corporation. But because it's called the Catholic Church and we associate that with sort of like a moral discourse, we think of it as a sort of pastoral organization, but it's actually its pastoral sort of duties and representations are dwindling, like numbers are dwindling. But as a corporation, it's just incredibly powerful. And because it's not seen as a corporation, it's seen as a church, that means that it has all these special conditions and privileges attached to it, that it doesn't have to meet the stringent sort of systems of human rights law. It's actually embedded in law that it can discriminate. So I think you've raised a really important point here.
Thank you. Who will be next?
I guess I have a couple of questions. First of all, thank you so much, Naomi and Kath. It's so much fun to see you. One of my questions is where Indigenous traditions fit in to this understanding or to the notion of the end of religion. But another is, I hear you talking a lot about states defining certain things as religion, that the definition of religion can be manipulated and changed by states in order to enforce male dominance. I'm not hearing as clearly what it means to say that religion itself is a vestigial state. I heard it in the last thing you said about the Catholic Church as a corporation, Kath. That made it clearest to me. But I'm having more trouble with that idea than seeing the way in which religion both uses and can be used and manipulated to enforce male dominance.
Shall
Yeah, go ahead, Naomi.
Okay, Indigenous traditions, very interesting, because Indigenous traditions had no, indigeneity had no idea about religion. There was not religion there. What happens is that certain things, certain practices of Indigenous communities get defined as religion. And it works in interesting ways. In some ways, it controls that community, because if it's not a governmental practice, for instance, the potlatch, the redistribution of goods and services were defined as a religious practice and not as an economic practice, for one thing. Various traditions of governance were defined as religious practices, not as governmental practices. So the term Indigenous spirituality is a way of taming a lot of Indigenous practice that could challenge dominant government. So that's one way to think about it. I had a student who did a really terrific master's thesis. He looked at what was happening in Western Canada when colonization was happening around the late 1800s, early 1900s. And you had middle-level bureaucrats trying to decide whether certain practices could be allowed or not allowed. They would write letters back and forth. And if they decided, or if a higher government said it was a religious practice, it could be allowed. So Indigenous groups realized that pretty quickly, and they started to define certain things that they were doing as religious practices, spiritual practices, so that that could be continued. And I want to bring up something maybe along these lines that it links up with Mary. I know you asked a larger question. The larger question is a bit harder to get at, but this can work in a good way too for various groups. I'm reading now Henry Louis Gates's book on the Black Church. And why was the Black Church so effective in mobilizing and becoming such a powerful force for Black culture in the United States? That was because of the position of it as a vestigial state that was able to be used very well. So in one way, yes, in one way, no, works. Now, the larger question that you asked, Judith, I don't quite know how to get at it. Maybe the idea just has to sit a bit because that's the crux of it all. It's things get recognized as religions generally because you have a male divinity. I mean, there are some outlying things, for instance, Wicca, whatever, but its position as a religion is very dicey. And so this special category that gets special treatment becomes, sometimes I think of it as something preserved in amber. It's preserving male dominance, the mystique of male rule. And that exerts a very big influence on all forms of regulation. It can be a powerful force of nostalgia for resurrecting that male dominance if the male dominance gets challenged in dominant government. Anyway, there's a little attempt to get at that.
Kath, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I mean, thanks, Judith. It's a really good question. I think it's something that I really struggled with when I was trying to understand this. And I guess another way just to say this is that if you look at religions and their histories, you will see that for most religions at some point they were states. And many of them are still trying to become states. And you know, we could look at Israel and what's happening in Israel, and we can look at Islamic State, which is, it's, you know, very clearly that was their agenda, to become a state. If we looked at the histories of Catholicism and Anglicanism, we would also see that. So one of the main arguments is of this theory is that the secular state is kind of doing a deal with these special groups not to become states.
Yeah. And
they offer them all these sort of privileges, but as we're also saying, they give them particular sort of functions, one of which is to this symbolic and real violence against women and children. That's part of which the state cedes to them, not sort of in a visible sort of way really, but you have to look for it and understand it. So yeah, it is sort of, I think it is it's tricky getting your head around this, but if you see it as a sort of historical process and start thinking about religions as once were states or groups that are trying to become states, that was helpful for me.
Not to mention the Holy See at the UN, but we'll save
exactly.
that.
Exactly. Right.
Save that for another day. We'll save Elizabeth Pritchard's response to reaction to me in the book, by the way, about that for another time too. But Judith, would you like to respond, or are you? No, you're okay. Okay. Next, Renata Rose, you had your hand up. You have to unmute yourself.
Yes.
Let's try to keep our questions brief so we can hear from lots of people.
I want to to point out that if the Catholic Church has such an enormous influence in Australia, and the Pope has just spoken out forcefully against nuclear weapons, the violence, the male violence that is really the top of it is nuclear weapons. Since the Pope has spoken out greatly that for the abolition of nuclear weapons, and that Australia could then sign the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. But normally Australia is allied to the United States, and the United States are, of course, very opposed to it. So if Naomi could say something about violence, male dominance, and the church, that would have a positive role to play right now.
Oh, I agree with you. The only thing I think I agree, besides, of course, I don't like nuclear weapons, is capital punishment. I'm very glad to hear that the Catholic Church opposes capital punishment, and I wish they had more traction on that sort of issue. So it does work both ways. That once it's understood as being part of government, it's a part of government that can both critique and support. But one of the things that it unequivocally supports is male dominance, I'm saying.
Who else would like to make a comment? Let me at least slip one in here of my own. What about the growing disinterest in religion? The nuns, N-O-N-E-S, the none of the above, or my new favorites, the never agains. What's the impact of that phenomenon in your theory? Are people leaving religion for something else? Have they been so persuaded by your view that they don't want to?
Yeah, right.
I know, as I read this, gosh, these people really got this right very early. But how do you explain that phenomenon, and what are the implications of it in terms of your theory? I'm fascinated by it, especially those never agains, never do that again. I mean, they're not just nuns and none of the above, but never again. Goodbye.
Do you want to talk about that, Kath, or whatever?
Yeah, Kath, how do you see that? You mentioned it earlier in terms of Australia and people, bailing in terms of religion, but what does that phenomenon have to do, or what's its impact on your theory at this point?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's a very sort of pervasive phenomenon of particularly the millennial generations. We've just done a big research project here, not me personally, but a group of sociologists of religion who found that the millennials were bailing from mainstream religions at a quite significant rate, but they had very high levels of social capital, so they're very sort of keen on multiculturalism, inclusivity, diversity, etc., etc. They don't mind people belonging to religions. They think that's a good thing, etc., etc. So that's interesting. But I think I'll just go back to that point I made before, that central and powerful religious groups in Western societies act as corporations, and that power hasn't diminished. The pastoral power, yes, for sure. So I think we need to be really careful when we're talking about that whole discourse of religion diminishing. I mean, certain kinds of practices certainly may be diminishing. Also, I don't think it's a global phenomenon. I think in many parts of the world, religion is on the rise and is very powerful. If we could look at the relationship between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state, which since the end of communism has become incredibly powerful, and they've there's an alliance there that's particularly dangerous. And also, I think Islam is, and particularly in the Middle East, is still obviously very powerful, and Catholicism in South America. So I think it is a sort of phenomenon of maybe Western democratic societies, but not so much of the globe. So again, I just sort of like in Western societies, I just point to the sort of corporatization processes of religion and ask the question of, are they transitioning into other kinds of organizations that still maintain this power and these functions? I don't know if that's an answer, Mary, but yeah, I'm kind of suspicious of the whole thing, really.
Naomi?
I'll just add that the category still works in constitutions and in law. And the nuns, I think of in some ways as a spectrum on atheists and atheism. Atheists still believe in the category. They believe that they're not believing in these and ideas, which they identify with the category. So in a way, the category is still being maintained. And when the nuns say, well, I'm not part of this thing, it's usually in the form of beliefs which have been put into this thing. So I don't see it as challenging the category or the position of the category in law. And that's my answer to this point. It's a very it's a slippery thing, and I think it's I don't see anything wrong with it. It probably is all to the good, but I wish there were more interrogation of what it is that is being rejected, and what I don't see being rejected is the category itself.
That's very helpful, Naomi. That's really clear, because that really is the issue, isn't it? That even the use of those terms reifies the category.
It reifies the category again. Right. To not be that, you have to know what that is and think it's the thing.
Right. So we have time for one more comment or question. Let's hear from one more person, and then I'm going to finish our official work, as it were, and then I'm going to open the Zoom for everybody, for those who wish to stay. So one more person might have a comment or question they'd like to raise. This would be the time.
Sure.
Rosemary Ganley, go ahead. I know you've been keep holding yourself back there, Rosemary. Go ahead.
That can't do it anymore. Naomi, I really appreciated your making the distinction between the work we've done in feminist theology
right,
and all the great faiths, and you've given us, you and Catherine, permission to take like a grander, more political critique. It really opened, like for Mary, it's opened my mind. You see, I've been thinking how disloyal I am to be moving along in the direction that you've just expressed, when the theologians have offered us different ways of liberating ourselves.
Right, exactly, and very good ways too.
Yeah, but politically, when you look at global, then we have this piece of work yet to do, and we'll give the leadership to you.
Rosemary, you will continue to lead this, and I can see that your column in the Peterborough paper will probably reflect this one of these weeks.
Sorry.
Naomi, go ahead.
I actually think a lot about whether this has anything to do with God or goddess. I don't think it does, because those are ideas, those are practices, those are concepts that inspire behaviors. It's the organization of anything under this special category that I'm talking about now, and that Kath and I are working on. Yeah, so glad you saw it.
Kath and Naomi, I can't thank you enough for opening this. If I said Pandora's box, would I at least be in the area of myth and not religion? You have opened for me in my reading of this book, The End of Religion, Feminist Reappraisals of the State, a lot of new ideas, and I am deeply in your debt. And I know I speak for all of us this afternoon in this water gathering, those who've asked questions and those who are harboring their questions still. I want to suggest that the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion would have a roundtable on this. So Judith Plaskow and other JFSR people, listen up here. I think a roundtable is absolutely in order on this. I think it's a foundational piece of work that we've, at least from our various starting points, and if I were to describe to you who some of these people are who are asking you questions and making comments, you'd understand the variety of our starting points as we look at this. And I think it's not to overstate it to say that you're looking at very foundational work, and I appreciate you bringing it to Water. All water programs are open to everyone. They are free. We do not charge for them. Your donations, however, are needed and welcome. What we try to do at Water is socialize resources so that those who can donate do so that we can always make water programs available to everyone without charge. We say at Water, if we share among us, there's enough. If we share among us, there's enough. And two people have shared extraordinarily today, Kathleen McPhillips in Australia and Naomi Goldenberg in Ottawa in Canada. We thank you both very, very much. Thank you for being part of this, everybody. And we wish you safe and healthy days ahead, vaccines when you can get them, and an enjoyable rest of the day. So the floor is now open. The official program has ended and the floor is open for continued conversation. Please go
Mary,
ahead.
I just got a question.
Yeah, go.
I was just, there's been a sort of discussion about how expensive the book is and the problem with academic sort of publishing, et cetera, et cetera. I just wondered with this book, is it possible, I wonder if Naomi and I could send a copy for the Water Library that people could borrow?
Yeah.
Or...
Well, it's right here. It's right here.
You have your copy?
You sent a copy, or your I should say your publisher sent a copy. And the problem with the book is, and it's not, has nothing to do with you, but the book is $128 or $143, which is really scandalous in my view. Apparently not considered all that expensive in Europe, but this is a scandalous price for a 200-page book, in the sense that the ideas are so important that one of the things that keeps the ideas from being shared is the price of the book.
Right.
And that's what a kind of conundrum that we need to put our good feminist heads to in the not too distant future. I'm, as I said earlier, in the process of working with someone who's trying to publish a book, a Cuban woman trying to publish Cuban feminist theology. How many people do you think can afford to pay $100 to read Cuban feminist theology? And that means that the talk about the colonization of knowledge. So the question is, will this book ever go into paperback, you all? And what's the way of getting it as an ebook?
Well, it only goes into paperback if it is a hugely successful seller.
I know, that's the rub.
Which is ridiculous, but it is available as an ebook. I'm just on Book Depository at the moment looking at Sunny saying this, the hard copy, but I know that it did come out as an ebook because that was its first publication. So I could certainly look into that.
Well,
But
if you send us that information, we'll share that, because I just think it's so important to be used for teaching, for example, to use this in a seminar or to use this with a group. $143 US is prohibitive for most people, but the ebook form would. And that's why thank you very much for making available the introduction and the first chapter. Those are really helpful to have. But Kath, your chapter, which I think is equally valuable, I wish people had that, because your religion as vestigial state is so clarifying about religion, gender, and violence that I think we need, people need that. But yes, there is a copy at Water if anybody wants to borrow it. But look at our audience. We're not, I'm looking at people from Western Canada, Boston, England, Ireland, Virginia. People are not here to borrow it, and then it's just a matter of sending it around. But
and I can just, I'm watching the chat, and Kimberly is saying that on Amazon Canada it can be purchased for $63.95 on Kindle, which is still very expensive. But Annalie Martin has said that it can be rented as an ebook for $12 on US Amazon. So that's much more doable, isn't it? And to rent for $12 and have a read. Also, I don't know people's associations with libraries, but hassle your libraries to get a copy of this book, either as an ebook version or a hard copy. That would be another way to do it.
And that's the publishing model, which is that if they can sell 1,000 copies to 1,000 libraries at $100, then they recoup, and then they'll talk about doing paper. in a number of these
Exactly,
instances.
exactly.
And you don't even get royalties on the first 500 in some cases,
Yeah.
which I think is also.
But yeah, I mean, you don't write academic books usually for royalties. I had an experience with Equinox. I ordered a book for my class. I wanted it to be an ebook. The ebook alone was $700 for the library, which was
Wow.
absolutely ridiculous. The ebook was much more than the hard copy. And I wish the library had told me about that, because I would have ordered 4 more hardbacks or something at the price of $700. And then it turned out it was very difficult for the students to use that. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I wonder if there's some way we could have a fund for feminist books that could be made available to places where there isn't a lot of traction. And maybe we can think about that in the future.
Yeah, so a lot of publishers just ask for a subsidy, or they say, well, can you buy, we'll publish it, but can you buy 300 copies, and that'll get us started. Well,
yeah,
there aren't conferences now for that. So the floor is open. If people want to ask questions of Kath and Naomi, please, this is your opportunity. This is called Dial a Religion Scholar.
Or just comments about anything.
Yes, Coralie, go ahead. Coralie Ling from Australia, up early this morning, Coralie. God help us.
I wanted to ask Kath about the interfaith, multi-faith ecumenical situation in Australia. I know I've been involved in them all, and it's certainly male dominated and patriarchal, but there's also possibilities, have been possibilities for, other perspectives. In the little group I'm in my city, we're very involved with ecology and with the Pride Centre supporting LGBTIQ plus groups within our city. So the pluses are there as well as the minuses, but maybe, I think you did cover that, but maybe you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Coralie. It's really nice to see you. I also wanted to say hello to Kerry Byrne. I can see that she's there as well. So she's in Melbourne, Australia. And any other Australians, thanks for getting up so early. Yeah, look, I think we're focused in the book, we were focused on a critique of religion. So we were using case studies and examples to sort of demonstrate our points there. And as Naomi was pointing out, there are a sort of like, the rise and discourse of feminist theologies, theologies, spiritualities has been extremely important in the liberation of women. So we don't want to sort of like downplay that at all. The opposite, really. I think the interfaith movement's a really good example, and I'm glad that you brought it up, because I think, and I'm not an expert in this area at all, you would know a lot more than I would, Coralie, about this, but I have read a little bit about this, and so I do know that that the possibilities for sort of speaking across these sort of very patriarchal ways of organizing what we would call sort of religious talk can be very powerful. But I guess the other thing that we've tried to do in the book is to show how interfaith and multi-faith in particular have been sites where it has been very problematic, and Sukhwant Dhaliwal talks about this in Britain very, very clearly, how it has been just had terrible outcomes for women, really, because the whole agenda of multi-faithism got picked up by male religious leaders, and that was authorised by the state. So I guess maybe the question for interfaith and multi-faith is, how do we work against that so that it's actually women's experiences and women's spaces that are encouraged, so that they find that there are spaces where they can talk and where they can raise these questions about the ways in which their voice and agency gets constricted in these spaces is would be really important. I mean, you know, it's only very recently in Australia has a feminist sort of voices of Islam become louder. It's taken a long time. I think partly because women have felt so intimidated, not just by Islamic discourse, but by the state and the way the state authorizes that discursive voice of violence against women. So yes, Susan Carlin wrote a book called Islam, which probably Coralie, you know, and Kerry, you would know. It's a really great book, and she's been a very important voice in Islamic feminism in Australia. But it is very hard to speak out against those loud male-dominated patriarchal voices. And yeah, it's good to hear that in the your interfaith experiences, that those spaces have been there.
Kath, that raises a question about concrete steps that you might propose to people, especially those who do have relationships with, pardon the term, religion, people like ministers or rabbis or nuns or imams. What do you say to them? I mean, what and, you know, I know the book wasn't focused on that, but I just wonder if you and Naomi have some ideas about that. I mean, for example, there are ways in which people who do that work are in an official capacity are, in fact, as you say, advantaged. For example, in the US, there are tax advantages to clergy whose housing allowances are not taxed, as I understand it, in the same way that others of us have our salaries taxed. And nobody cares what you pay for your mortgage or your rent. So what is it that, you know, is this really just one more implication that the government really has people sort of bamboozled? And what's your posture on this? What do you say to people, you know, sort of real world people, not the theoretical question, but real world? What should they do? What would be helpful? What are some ways that, you know, people who get what you're talking about, but want to do things differently? What do you say?
Well, you've got to use the fulcrum that you have. I mean, you've got a powerful fulcrum in the way it's been constructed. The government has constructed something for you, and use it as best you can, but also realize what it is you're doing. And I think also be aware that the pressure to continue male dominance and male hegemony is huge within that context. So to work against that, but to use what you've got, and that's the lesson of the Black church. They really did use and they continue to use what they have, this quasi-governmental space. But to realize it as a quasi-governmental space, and then to try to, I think, mitigate the patriarchal foundation of it and the perpetuation of patriarchy within it. I think that's the challenge. But definitely use it. I mean, I'm glad the Pope is advocating for the end of capital punishment. And I'm glad that he's fighting nuclear weapons as well. And I don't know if he had any. Maybe he would still do it, or maybe not. But whatever, it could be envy of the weapons themselves. But I don't think that this interferes with anybody's good works. I think this could just make you more aware of the conditions which are enabling you to do what you do well.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I think that's a great way to say that, Naomi. And I think vestigial state theory is a tool that we can use to understand what is the work that we are doing here. How is it constricted and how is it enabled? And as Coralie was saying, like, you know, she can see that in the work that she's doing with her interfaith group, that there are really positive sort of outcomes here. So I think that's great. And I think, you know, one of the interesting things is that I think wherever you are, speaking up about violence against women is just so important. Every time you do that, it's a critique of the vestigial state. And one of the really great and interesting things that's happened in Australia is the rise of women's anger, which this year has been very profound. We've had huge protest movements and gatherings in Australia because there's been an expose of sexual violence against women at the federal parliament, no less, and state parliament levels. And in a way, like our sort of our parliaments and states, they do kind of, in a way, mimic vestigial states in a way that they think that they are sort of safe from forms of violence against women because they uphold the laws of the Constitution and laws of the land. But in fact, parliaments are some of the worst places for women in terms of violence and aggression. And that was what got exposed in Australia in March, when a young woman, Brittany Higgins, came out and said that she'd been raped in the parliamentary offices as part of her work for one of the senators. So the fact that she did that just sort of galvanized women around the country, and we got very, very angry about it. And other women started coming out and telling their stories of sexual abuse and violence. And it just exposed the whole thing. And I think and somehow the nation was kind of ready to hear it as well. So the government has had to just really respond to that. They couldn't shove it under the carpet, which is what they usually do. So I think anytime it gets called out is really important. And that's what feminism is about. That's what we're doing. We're trying to call it out all the time and propose different ways of relating and communicating and being together that don't rely on these forms of aggression and violence, if that makes sense.
A lot of sense. Thank you. Cynthia Tootle, you're next.
I just wanted to follow up a question on that. And it's like, so how did the Roman Catholic Church Corporation in Australia respond to this, discussion of violence in the parliament?
Well, great question, Cynthia. Like the first thing is that when we talk about Catholicism in Australia, I think it's really important to note that it's very broad and diverse. So you use the right words there. It is about how did the leadership respond, and in essence, they didn't. So they were just silent. So we haven't really heard anything from the religious leaders. But they're going to have to say something. I mean, a big study has just been completed on violence against women in the Anglican Church, or the Episcopal Church, as you would call it in Australia, and on domestic violence or family violence. And it's been known for a long time anecdotally that violence against women, sexual violence and coercive control, is probably higher in religious faith traditions. Mm-hmm. There's partly because of the theologies of headship and male dominance, which sort of give men license to abuse women, but also partly because religions, again, are just sort of flying under the radar here. They don't have the regulatory mechanisms that other institutions do. So this study is actually about to come out, and it's highly likely that what they will have found is that levels of violence against women in faith-based families are higher, and there are particular kinds of violence. So it's going to actually confirm what we have been thinking for a long time. And yeah, I think I don't know if that answers your question, Cynthia, but yeah, it's these sorts of responses are really, really important that we do actually demonstrate it. But yeah, the leadership of the Catholic Church has just been silent about this.
Yeah, well, that is its own statement.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Just a footnote to that too, that it's interesting to me to note that the Anglican Church in Australia has a long history of women being ordained, and whether that has any impact at all, it seems it doesn't, if this is what it's going to show. And the interesting, I don't know if it was Australia or New Zealand, where there was the first and only study I've ever seen where there was a claim that the ordination of women in traditions like that improved the quality of ministry. And so there's been a long kind of decades of this work. So it'll be very interesting to see if in a tradition where you have decades of women's leadership, you still have this same problem, and even more pointedly, perhaps. That's really a nightmare scenario.
Yeah, I should point out that the study has been in the Sydney Archdiocese, which is the only archdiocese in Australia that doesn't ordain women.
Well, that might tell us something.
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, I know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Who else? Anybody else? Questions, comments? Please go ahead.
Or is there somebody else? I just wanted to bring up an interesting.
You, Naomi, you.
Oh, okay. I'm reading Catherine Stewart's book, The Power Worshippers, and there's such interesting connections between patriarchy and racism. She points out that abortion, which I think many of you know, has rather recently been discovered as a great unifying field for the right to proclaim that women shouldn't have control of their reproductive rights has been a great rallying cry. It was Phyllis Schlafly who figured that out. But I didn't know that the major thing in the 70s and 80s that the US Protestant churches, many of them, were trying to fight was tax-exempt status for segregated schools. So they latched on to abortion, anti-abortion rhetoric as a way of keeping their power and keeping a tax-exempt status, which I think they've lost subsequently, but it was connected. So that to bring up something that will reinforce patriarchy was a way to disguise or to take the focus off the racism that they were really interested in protecting. And there's so many of those little connections, that tax-exempt status being conferred because religion is vestigial state, right there.
So how does that relate, Naomi, to what I said at the outset of the question period about structural racism? And it seems to me that your analysis, and maybe you're just not there yet in terms of the kind of work you're doing, but it seems to me that what you both are talking about, Kathy, you'd have some ideas on this, I'm sure, that if in fact what you're describing has as its consequence increased and more effective, more efficient, more economical sexism, does it have the same impact in terms of racism? Or what are some of the parallels and differences? Maybe
well, I'm not, you know, that hasn't been my field. I'm not quite sure.
But in the roundtable, someone will surely take it up, Naomi.
Yeah. And I'll say I'm very interested in the topic. Yeah. I mean, whenever I see the ties to sexism and racism, it's fascinating, like this abortion connection, right. Is that a great rallying cry for keeping religious power has always been the repression of women. And then that can be used to disguise many other things. And in this case, in the United States, it was that the tax-exempt status of segregated schools was kept, religious schools was kept going because they were able to muster this anti-women feeling. So that's one of the angles. I mean, we've had wonderful leadership coming out of the Black church, and I wouldn't want to take that away because that's been a consequence of the status of vestigial states and the connection with churches.
But
So,
I would say in that case, Naomi, it's also been at the expense of Black women that
but I couldn't say that, and I would want Black women to have to.
I would want Black women, but Black women in this forum have said that. We had, I have to go back and look at the title of the book, but we had a wonderful presentation about the way in which Black women's leadership has been kept down in those churches. And that's a very important piece of this, I think.
That's what Sukwant Dhaliwal's essay in our book has pointed out, is that what gets enabled as by governments are things that look like what they think of as religions, which are male-dominated places. So a great deal of support is given for male leadership, but that would have to be an analysis that would have to be done by people within those groups.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess what I want to point out to other people is that the way this book unfolds is that we take a kind of germinal idea of vestigial state, and then there are lots of examples of it. I particularly was impressed with the work in the Latin American context. I thought the Mexican case study was really Larissa Garrett's work. I'm sure she was a student of yours.
Yeah, really.
And I'm sure Andrew Pump was also a student of yours. I could pick out students in here, but I was so glad to see that she cited the work of Nancy Pineda Madrid, Suffering and Salvation in Ciudad Juarez, that we also had a WATERtalk with her about the femicide in several years ago. I mean, that book goes back to 2014. But I thought that her work was very much an exposition of how this theory plays out in the Catholic context. And then Catholic, of course, what you pick up in terms of the clergy sexual abuse does the same thing, and what Pump does as well on anti-feminism and homophobic nature of state governments. I mean, it becomes quite clear. So then the question is, what happens in other parts of the world? I mean, what happens in developing countries? This seems to have, it's like what you said, Kath, in terms of capitalism being sort of the goal of all of this, maintaining capitalism and the colonial narrative, which is throughout, both in the Australian context, the Canadian context, our own context in the US. But have you thought about what it would mean, for example, in an African context? What does this mean in developing countries? That's why the Latin American one was so, and Mexico is a kind of funny, it's developing, et cetera. But I just wonder if you had any thoughts about that. Again, I'm pushing you past where you are, and I don't want to make it sound as if you haven't done something here, but I'm just so curious about how this is going to play out, where you see it going.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I think, look, this is just our first, I think the first iteration of the book and and the sort of like the feel, the idea. So I think, many more accounts that can flesh out this concept and add to our understandings of it would be really fantastic. That would just be, that's what we hope for, that it can lead to a much larger conversation. And yeah, you see the method of the book is to kind of set out the sort of principles and idea and then provide case studies of what it looks like. And Larissa Garrett's work on Mexico is just a brilliant sort of case study of the terrible sort of sexual abuse against women and the femicides that were happening. So I don't know. I kind of like, of course, I guess that's up to sort of theorists who are experts in that area. Yeah, but one thing I will say is that I do know from the institutional church-based child sexual abuse that Africa and Asia are two areas or two sites where there has been very, very little investigation, but where, for example, the Catholic Church is very powerful, particularly in Africa, and it's a very conservative, very patriarchal church, as we know. So, I think it's fairly kind of accepted amongst theorists who are looking at institutional child sexual abuse that these accounts will come out, but they haven't come out yet, partly because it takes years and years and years for victims to disclose, because it's such a shaming thing. and the institutions are so powerful, and the state may not be, you know, interested in hearing about it or have any mechanisms for redress or justice. And as we know, the church, the reputation of the church is more important than anything. So they act to silence these kinds of claims. But we would certainly expect that currently in Africa and parts of Asia, that children and women are not safe, and that there is a high level of violence against women and children. So that's sort of like the hypothesis. It's a pretty terrible hypothesis, but there's plenty of other Western countries as well that have been sort of pretty lax in investigating. And when they do investigate, for example, the ICSAR inquiry in Britain and Wales at the moment, it just keeps falling over. I mean, they're very hard inquiries to run because they're incredibly difficult. It's difficult material, but it just keeps falling over. There are so many problems with it at the level of governance. So even running the inquiries, and you would know this from the US, has been incredibly problematic. But yeah, I think it would be great. I think Naomi and I would be very keen to see this idea taken up and people running with it and providing more case studies.
Yeah, and I know Naomi wants to comment, but all I'm going to say is that I hope reviewers of your book can see this feminist methodological dimension of it as really salient and as exemplary, because I think what you're doing is opening the floodgates, and then lots of people in lots of different settings can pick up a germinal idea and see how it works, where it works, if it works. But you're really doing that in a very invitational way. So I want to just make sure that people who review your book or those who read the book understand that fundamental methodological foundation, which I think is just really exemplary. So I thank you for that. Naomi, go ahead.
Yeah, just thinking about India, I've been following that a little bit. Look what Modi is doing with the category of religion, which is introduced into India, that he then picks up. And violence against women is increasing. His government is more and more patriarchal. He's using that category as a club, which is not a native category, but now it is an international way of cementing his power, because he is both the dominant state and the vestigial one. So he gets the power of that patriarchy. I think that's an example of some of what could be done with the theory.
Captain Naomi, any final words from you?
No, just thank you very much. It's very exciting to hear feedback, to hear people doing something with the thinking, and I just am very grateful. Thanks very much.
Sure.
Yeah, ditto. Yeah, ditto. It's so good to you know, we've lived with this book for so long. We've been sort of like in a bit of a bubble with it. So it's great that it's been birthed and it's out there and people are reading it. And I hope it has a life of its own, and that, as you say, you know, that it encourages a greater conversation. And really grateful, Mary, that you were able to offer this opportunity for us to share our ideas.
Well, thank you to both of you. It's just wonderful for us at Water. And I can tell from the comments in the chat and from other comments in the discussion that even though people are new to it, you know, that sometimes makes it more difficult when you're new to it to actually formulate a question. But I'd bet you if we had this again in 6 months, you'd get a lot of, Anne McDermott is shaking her head, and I'm sure there are others who would say, you know, if we were to have it again in 6 months, I bet you'd get another kind of feedback that would be very helpful. Which is why I'm pushing that roundtable question. I really do that.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. It's a great idea.
Yeah. Great. Well, I'm going to, I think, close the event here again with thanks to Kath. Have a great day.
Thank you.
It was not too cold there. Carly said it was getting cold in Australia the other night, so it's getting a little nippy there. And Naomi, I hope it's beautiful in Ottawa. This has to be
well, it's a little cool, but it's very nice.
Great. Great. Well, good to see you both.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye, everyone.
everybody.
Bye.
Good morning, everybody.
Thank you.